Why President Zachary Taylor's missteps on slavery pushed the United States further towards civil war. After Taylor's inauguration as president, the conflict between the South and the North over the subject of slavery grew increasingly bitter. Southerners opposed the admission of California, New Mexico, and Utah into the Union as free states, and were particularly unhappy with the frequent refusal of Northerners to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and to aid fugitive slaves, with Texas even threatening to send in the state militia to militarily enforce its claim to the eastern portion of New Mexico, while Northerners demanded that Washington, D.C. abolish the domestic slave trade. Although himself a Southern slaveholder, Taylor increasingly sided with the anti-slavery Northerners. However, his enactment of the Mexican Cession as free drew Southern resentment, and his opposition to the Compromise of 1850, proposed by Clay, the political leader of the Northerners, drew Northern protests. Faced with his own political isolation and rising North-South tensions, instead of compromising, he forcefully threatened to lead his own army into New Mexico to protect its borders from Texas. This, in turn, was staunchly resisted by his own political ally, Political Secretary Crawford. In the end, no major compromise on the subject of slavery was reached during his short presidency. Why was President Fillmore's Fugitive Slave Act an utter failure? He signed the Fugitive Act of 1850. The act provided severe penalties for anyone who assisted a slave in escaping and provided no due process of law to fugitive slaves, who had no opportunity to testify before a magistrate. In addition, the act allowed for a higher honorarium for magistrates once a fugitive was found to be a slave, rather than a free man, which would have motivated the magistrates to condemn otherwise free blacks to slavery from the standpoint of financial gain. As a result, the act was deeply offensive to many Northerners, and abolitionists criticized it as grossly unjust. Southerners were greatly offended by the lack of enforcement of the law and the government's practice of repatriating slaves, as well as some of the lawsuits, often ended badly because they were unpopular, and arrested abolitionists were repeatedly acquitted by the courts under the pressure of public opinion. So, it is clear that enforcement brought widespread anger in both the North and the South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, another propeller of the Civil War? In 1854, President Pierce pushed for the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which provided for the self-determination of local residents to allow slavery after the division of territories. After the bill was passed, thousands of frontier ruffians who supported slavery but didn't even live in the Kansas Territory traveled from Missouri to vote, and in the end, Kansas became a slaveholding state. Pierce supported the outcome of this vote. The people who favored Kansas as a free state formed a shadow government of Kansas and drafted the Topeka Constitution, which Pierce called a rebellion, and sent federal troops to dismantle that shadow government. But the federal troops did not prevent a major fight between groups with different positions in the Kansas Territory, known in history as the Kansas Civil War. Why President Buchanan pushed for an escalation of the looming Civil War? In October 1857, the Lecompton government enacted the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, agreeing to hold a plebiscite limited to the issue of slavery, but according to the Lecompton Convention, an anti-slavery vote would still allow for the enslavement of existing slaves and all their descendants. Buchanan accepted Constitution despite resistance from anti-slavery residents and opposition from the governor of the Kansas Territory, and pushed for it to win Senate ratification. Although it was ultimately rejected by the House of Representatives, his approach, once again, exacerbated the conflict between the South and the North. Faced with a secession crisis in which the southern slaveholding states declared their secession from the Union, he insisted that the federal government had no power to stop them, and blamed the crisis on the overreaching of the people of the North on the various slavery issues in the South, arguing that the only proposal for a solution was an interpretive amendment. He chose to seek a compromise in the face of the looming act of war in South Carolina, which made the rebel states more arrogant and more amply prepared for war. Was President Lincoln responsible for the Civil War? During his campaign, he repeatedly expressed his opposition to slavery, emphasizing his rejection of any search for a middle ground between right and wrong. However, he insisted that this was only a moral position, saying that he had no intention of abolishing slavery as it existed in the southern states. But it was this mild anti-slavery stance that was enough to enrage Southern secessionists, who flatly carried out their plan to secede from the Union before Lincoln's inauguration. Perhaps because he underestimated the South's determination to secede, overestimated their identification with the unity of the Union, or was unwilling to be the first to leave behind the blood of his brothers at a time when the South was preparing for the coming war, Lincoln, while explicitly declaring secession to be unlawful, continued to work to avert the conflict by failing to treat secession as an act of war and supporting the Corwin Amendment to the Constitution, which would have protected slavery in states where it already existed. It was with this cautious plea for peace from Lincoln that the Confederacy fired the first shots of the Civil War at Fort Sumter.